Today, the president unveiled in the Rose Garden his plan for reducing the deficit by over $4 trillion over 10 years, as he put it. He said he's going to cut $2 for every $1 raised in revenue. My question to you, Henry, is this an effective plan?
I think it's a plan that both sides are going to hate and trash, and yet a plan that gives both sides a little bit that they may like, but it's going to infuriate everybody because he is cutting spending and he's cutting some of the sacred cows like Medicare, which is a Democratic sacred cow, yet he's also raising taxes, which the Republicans are dead set against. So there's going to be a ton of screaming about it. If you're actually going to approach our deficit problem intelligently, this is a good start. If a family is in financial trouble, are you going to just address that by cutting spending? No, you might also want to address it by increasing revenue. Are there other jobs we can take and so forth? So I think in terms of just trying to address the problem, this is an intelligent start. That said, we live in a political system. Both sides are going to be screaming at the top of their lungs about this.
Well, help us understand that, Henry. How does cutting the deficit relate to growing the economy and creating jobs?
Well, so right now, the U.S. GDP, the economy, is heavily dependent on government spending. So the Republicans obviously say at the top of their lungs, we've got to cut spending. We have an unsustainable deficit. Spending has ballooned, so forth. What's really happened is that the revenue the government collects has dropped sharply because the economy has gone into the tank. We're now collecting about 14 to 15% of GDP. It used to be almost close to 20% of GDP, and that's partially because it's not growing. So the question is, how do you address that? And most reasonable economists who aren't arguing from one side or the other will tell you, you've got to work on both sides, at least over the short term. And so the president is trying to do that. He's trying to say, I will give you some spending cuts, and I will even go after something that my team holds very dear. But also we're going to raise taxes on millionaires, which obviously the Republicans can't stand.
Well, help us understand this as well. Oftentimes when our politicians tell us that they are cutting, what they're really doing is cutting the rate of growth.
Absolutely.
So is that what we're talking about here, that over the next 10 years government will grow more slowly? Less rapidly?
Definitely. I mean, if you look at projections for Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security spending, their spending grows rapidly over time. And what President Obama is proposing here is that we reduce that rate of growth, not that we actually cut spending. And ultimately, according to their calculations, and you could have a field day going over the assumptions in terms of growth that those depend on, we will reduce the deficit by $3 trillion thanks to this new spending. $4 trillion overall, including the stuff they already did this summer.
So for some of our more conservative or libertarian-minded viewers, we're not actually shrinking the size of government as we know it today.
Possibly some of the proposals call for certain things to shrink. President Obama's plan does, in fact, attack wasteful government spending. So what does that mean? It's a big
waste, fraud,
budget.
abuse, everybody's
exactly.
on board
You
for
could
that.
go in, and if it were a corporation, you could restructure it, and you could cut out a lot of costs. Government has a very tough time doing that, but this plan promises that they will do some of that. Whether that in aggregate reduces the spending from today's levels of certain divisions of the government remains to be seen. We've got to see the details.
Well, let me ask you this. The president announcing this plan today, cutting over $4 trillion of the deficit. What will be the short-term impact on the economy, and can this plan create jobs?
This is phased in over time. The tax increases that are contemplated, one of the things that the Republicans have been very afraid of, and justifiably so, is that if you raise taxes in a weak economy, usually you hurt the economy because you're taking money out of people's pockets that they can't spend, and so forth. So
isn't it also the case you're taxing the folks who create jobs? So those millionaires that Obama's referring to are also a lot of small businesses.
That's right. Although I think that if you actually ask, nobody likes higher taxes, obviously. But if you ask folks who are making more than $1 million a year, seriously, whether a few point percentage increase in the tax rate that they pay would really make them work less, most of them, when they're being honest, will say, no, of course not, it wouldn't. But it's the principle, the spending's too high, and obviously the spending has to be cut.
If I made $1 million a year, I wouldn't work at all.
Oh, you wouldn't? Well, yeah, you'd give up a lot.
Right.
But most will say, in private at least, okay, fine, taxes aren't that high that I would stop working. Obviously, there is a level at some point, you get into the brackets of 80% tax 90% of your income, sure, major disincentive to not work. But
pre-JFK levels.
That's right,
He
exactly.
reduced taxes from 90%
Absolutely,
on down.
but we are nowhere near that today. And in fact, we're at a very historically low rate for the top earners in the society. So that is one point that people make. You're going to hammer the people who are very productive. But I think, again, stepping back, there are very few nonpartisan economists who look at our deficit, which is a major problem, and say you can solve it either by cost cutting or by tax increases. Most say you've got to have a combination of both, at least over the short term.
And we need to do that to create jobs?
Well, you need to do it, and bear in mind that if you were to suddenly hike taxes or cut spending in the near term, you would hammer the economy. And so if you look at the president's plan, the tax increases he talks about don't go into effect until 2013, so that's a year or two. The Medicare cuts, which obviously people are very concerned about, actually don't hit beneficiaries until 2017. So it is phased in.
So you don't see politics behind that timing so much as economic?
Oh, of course there's politics behind it. The whole thing is politics. There's no question about it. But I just think for conservative viewers who say that the only answer to our problem is that you're going to whack spending, the only thing that I would say strongly is, does that mean you want to whack spending right now? Because if you whack spending right now, the economy is going to suffer. And all you need to do to see that is to look to Europe right now, where that was the initial answers. We got to get serious about the deficit. Government spending is bloated. We got to cut it. They've done that. And the deficits have gotten wider because, in fact, a lot of that government spending is actually keeping our GDP up. So the sensible, or at least disruptive way of approaching it is to do it slowly over time. And I think that's what a lot of people have been looking for, is a cohesive plan over time. And this does give something to both sides.
What about the argument, though, that we're already suffering, so why not just take our lumps now?
Well, we are already suffering. There's no question. We have tremendously high unemployment rate. There's no near-term sign that anything's going to change to that. I don't know. I mean, it depends what your attitude is. If you want to whack it and take the unemployment rate to 13, 14, 15% and just say that's what, we're just going to take it all in one go and we're going to reconstruct from there. The big caveat that I'd have there is it is in those kind of environments that you start to get real extremists who often take control of government. You look at the political arena that Hitler came to power in, for example, he didn't start out as the Hitler that we think of. He just thought of as change. It sucks here. We've got to get somebody with strong feelings in. It was after he gained power that he enacted all these reforms that gave him full power and so forth. So getting the unemployment rate higher than it is today, it's already incredibly disruptive and scary, and just millions of Americans are hurting as a result of it. To go way higher than that could be a lot more disruptive. So I think there is a lot of good wisdom in saying we have a major long-term problem, and as a society we have got to be serious about it and tackle it over 10 years, but that maybe we don't want to just take that one lump sum cold turkey hit.
I see. You've mentioned Europe a couple of times. Let's move to that. What is the outlook with Europe, with Germany under pressure to bail out Greece, Germans not wanting to, in fact, registering their irritation quite vocally? Where is the European economic situation? Are we, as American taxpayers, going to be called upon to bail them out when we're, here struggling?
They would love for us to bail them out, obviously, but Europe is a disaster. I mean, this is a classic case of a slow-motion train wreck. There isn't any serious analyst who believes that Greece, for example, has a hope in hell of paying back the money it's borrowing. The only people who are still maintaining that Greece can pay back the money are Greece and the ECB folks who are approving these loans.
And
everybody else
ECB
thinks it's the European Central Bank.
Okay.
So the idea is we'll just give them a little bit more money, they will raise taxes and they'll cut spending and they'll get their budget balanced and then they'll be able to pay us back. That is a crock, and no serious economist believes that. And part of the problem is when you cut spending in an economy that is so dependent on government spending the way Greece is, you crush the economy. And that in turn reduces government revenue going forward. And so the deficit actually gets bigger. So there is no happy solution for Greece other than restructuring the debt, admitting they can never pay it back, and as anybody who defaults, you get the debts restructured and you go on from there. But to do that means that the folks who have lent Greece money idiotically are going to have to actually get hammered.
I want to ask you about that. Lending
Correct.
to Greece. It strikes me, it has all along that when, there's that adage, when you owe the bank $1, they owe you, or they own you. When you owe them $1 million, you own them. Is this a case that Greece was able to extract so much loan money that the EU is almost obliged to keep them afloat if they have any hope of getting that money back?
The EU feels that that's what they have to do. And this, by the way, this way of dealing with a crisis like this, we are almost 100% to blame in the United States. We had the pathetic bailouts in 2008, 2009 of our own financial institutions where the banks made utterly idiotic and reckless loans to governments, companies, individuals, and so forth, and yet we decided we had to protect them 100 cents on the dollar or civilization would end. That was the policy of the prior administration, and that has been the policy of the Obama administration.
I'll tell you, Henry, I happen to know someone who was in the room when our former Treasury Secretary was meeting to try to come up with that bailout number, and I was told that it literally was out of thin air.
Absolutely.
The discussion was, can we make it $1 trillion? They decided the politics of that would be impossible. What other number can we throw out? And
so we set the precedent when we did that bondholders, the people who made the idiotic loans to bad creditors, were going to be protected 100 cents on the dollar. We set that precedent. We have stuck by it ever since. As a result, we now in our society have these massive zombie banks that their books are still filled with bad debts. They have not written them down. They're not lending in part because they haven't been fixed yet. And now Europe is going through the exact same thing. You've got weak countries, bankers made stupid loans to do it, and yet the world believes collectively, in part because we did it, that if you ever force those bondholders to take a loss, that the whole system will end. Most people would tell you that if you're aggressive and you go in and you recapitalize the banks, so the European Central Bank says, let's take $1 trillion. We're going to go out and we're going to give that money to the banks, but we are also going to force them to acknowledge that those debts to Greece are bad, and we're going to write them all the way down. You hurt bondholders, and you certainly hurt the equity holders of the banks, but you fix the system quickly. And this is the way a bankrupt family would approach the problem, or a bankrupt individual. How can I restructure my debts? We as a country have refused to do that, and Europe has refused to do that.
Will American taxpayers be on the hook?
They will be on the hook in some way. Our banks have probably guaranteed, through the form of derivatives and other things, a lot of the debt in Europe. We don't know how much, because we still don't have clarity into what are called credit default swaps and other derivatives.
So through the private market will be on the hook. Politically, will we be asked for taxpayer dollars to go to this?
Well, certainly the Fed will guarantee that the ECB, the European Central Bank, can have as much money as it wants in order to make loans to the banks in dollars and so forth. And there will be some collateral backing that up. But we are all in this together. I mean, if Europe were to implode, that would be horrendous for the United States on many, many levels, and horrendous for business people and so forth. So collectively, we've got to figure out a problem. The problem is the solution we've figured out thus far is kick the can down the road, hope and pray, and it's just not happening.
Henry, last question before we go, and I could have this conversation for another hour. It's fascinating, and it is, of course, the topic of the day in terms of the economy, jobs, etc. Last question, inflation went up 0.5% on food prices. Energy prices are going up. It's volatile. Is this something you have your eye on? The Fed has kept those interest rates low, which has always worried economists that could press inflation higher. Are we starting to see that?
It's definitely something to watch, and I think it's very important to any individual that food prices and oil prices are so high. Obviously, the government wants to sit there and argue that, oh, you can just ignore those because they're volatile. You and I actually have to drive and eat, so we're going to pay them.
Real families are being affected
Absolutely.
by this.
Now, that said, people have been worried about runaway inflation for the last 3 years. It's been this real debate in the economic community about what we're going to be hit with. Some folks have worried about deflation, others have worried about inflation. If you look at countries that have gone through what we went through, which is really a debt-fueled recession that we are by no means out of yet, usually deflation is the big problem. And the analogy there is Japan, where they have been flooding the system with money for almost 20 years now, and they've never stimulated inflation. They have little bursts and then it goes back down because everyone is trying to work off their debts. And in an environment like we have now, where 9% of the country is unemployed, it's hard to see where the spending power comes from to drive up prices, which is what you get with inflation. That said, the world as a whole is consuming a lot more commodities. You've got China and India, all these massive countries coming online.
Energy
There's
in
more
particular.
demand, exactly, for oil. That is driving prices high, so it's not a U.S. phenomenon anymore. So it is definitely something to watch. And the worst of all worlds, of course, is that we have a slow or no growth environment like we have now with inflation.
So stagflation.
Exactly.
Jimmy
that
Carter
would be
years.
horrible. And it is totally something to watch.
Okay, I lied. One more question because you just brought this up for me. When are we going to see the end of this? When the end of this recession? Some economists are worried about a double dip. Do you think that we are on the brink of riding down that roller coaster again?
I think there are a lot of leading economic indicators that suggest we're at real risk of a recession. There's no question. And part of the issue is that because the last stimulus has been perceived not to work, and we have such a massive deficit now, and the Republicans are taking such a hard line on any sort of stimulus, it will be very hard for the government to do anything, even if there is some collective agreement that maybe stimulus would help. A lot of people say stimulus doesn't work, we've proved that, so we can fight about that all day, but the government has shot a lot of bullets, and there isn't a lot of political will to do anything anymore.
This vampire recession
That's
is
right.
going to
And then the other
keep
problem
stalking
is,
us?
if you look at Japan, and if you believe that what we are going through is not some normal cyclical weakness, but in fact we are paying the price for 25 years of borrowing until we had debt coming out of our ears. Normally, historically, it takes a long time to work out of that. You have 5 to 10 years of very subpar growth. So that's why a lot of economists look at the situation and say, are we going to shrink over the next 5 to 10 years? Probably not, but the idea that we're going to suddenly go back to 4 to 5% growth seems crazy. The consensus now is maybe we dance around 2%, which will be very disappointing for a lot of Americans who are used to a couple of decades of much faster growth.
Yes. Bill Gates, we need your next best idea.
We do.
Henry, thank you so much. I appreciate
Thank
the
you for having me.
conversation.
Absolutely.
Thank you.